The nursery pod was empty. I felt it before I saw it, a wrongness that hit my chest like a blow. The warmth was gone, the soft chirping sound that always filled that chamber, the sound of my youngest clutchling breathing in its sleep, had stopped. I threw myself across the room and tore the silk lining apart with my claws, searching for a small body that was simply not there. My name is Sushkara. I am the broodmother of the third spire, mother to 11 clutches, and queen to 8,000 of my kind. I have led hunts against storm beasts 3 times my size. I have stared down human warships without blinking, but in that moment, kneeling in an empty nest with torn silk in my claws, I was not a queen. I was only a mother who could not find her child. I screamed. The sound rolled down the tunnels of the spire like thunder, and within seconds, my guards came running, weapons raised, ready to fight an enemy that was not there. I did not have words for them at first. I only pointed at the empty nest and let them understand. The youngest of my clutch was barely into its second molt. Its shell was still soft. It could not fly far, could not fight, could not even call for help in a voice loud enough to carry across the ravines outside our spire. If something had taken it, or if it had simply wandered too far from home, every hour that passed made survival less likely. My second in command, a broad-shouldered warrior named Cressa, reached me first. She did not ask foolish questions. She had raised younglings of her own once, before we lost them to the wars with the old empires, and she understood exactly what my silence meant. "When did you last see it?" she said. "Before the storm," I answered. My voice did not sound like my own. I checked the nest before I went to the treaty meeting. It was sleeping. It is always sleeping at that hour. Cressa's eyes moved to the wall of the nursery, where a gap in the outer shell let in a thin line of gray light. The storm shutters had not been sealed properly. Rain had come in. Wind had come in. And through that gap, something small enough could have slipped out, chasing a smell or a sound into the dark. I did not wait for anyone to finish that thought. I was already moving. Outside, the storm was still breaking apart in the distance, thunderheads dragging their bellies over the jagged spires of rock that gave our home its name. This moon was a hard place to live, even for my kind, who could endure heat that would blister softer skin, and cold that would freeze softer blood. For a hatchling barely out of its egg case, the ravines beyond the spire were not a home. They were a grave waiting to happen. I stood at the entrance and called out into the wind, using the low-frequency call that only a mother and her clutch can hear clearly, a sound built into our bones before we ever hatch. I called and I listened. Nothing answered. Cressa caught up to me, already strapping on her flight harness. "The elders will want to speak with you before you go further," she said carefully. "You know what is out there beyond our border. You know what is close to it." I knew exactly what she meant, and just saying it out loud made my blood run hot with something between fear and fury. 3 days before, a group of humans had arrived on this moon and set up a research camp less than half a day's flight from our spire. They came under an old treaty, one signed generations ago between my hive and the human worlds, a fragile peace built on distance and mistrust more than any real friendship. The treaty said they could dig in the old ruins scattered across this moon's northern plain, studying whatever secrets the long-dead builders had left behind. It said nothing about what would happen if a hatchling of mine ever wandered close to their camp. I had opposed the treaty meeting from the very start. I had sat across from their lead scientist, a tired-looking woman with gray eyes and a translator device clipped to her collar, and I had told her plainly that I did not trust her people. Humans were young, I said. Humans were reckless. Humans burned through their own history faster than any species I had studied, and I did not believe a species built on that kind of hunger could be trusted near anything soft or small. She had not argued with me. She had simply said that trust was not built in one meeting, and that her people intended to keep their word regardless of what I believed about them. I had walked out of that meeting unconvinced, and now, 3 days later, my youngest child was missing, and the humans were the closest thing to danger for half a world in every direction. "Take me to the border," I told Cressa. "Now." We flew low and fast, following the line of broken cliffs that marked the edge of our territory. Below us, the ravines cut through the stone like old scars, deep enough to swallow the light even at midday. Somewhere down there, in that maze of rock and shadow, my child was either hiding or hurt, or already gone. I refused to let myself think the third option all the way through. The wind carried strange scents up from the ravines, sharp and mineral, mixed with the wet smell of storm runoff still draining toward the lowlands. I flew with my sensory frills spread wide, searching for anything that matched the particular scent of my own clutch, a scent every mother learns before her eggs even crack open. For a long while there was nothing. Then, just past a narrow gap between two towers of black stone, I caught it, faint, fading, but real. I dropped out of the sky so fast that Cressa shouted a warning behind me, afraid I would break my own wings on the landing. I did not care. I hit the ground hard, claws digging furrows into wet stone, and I followed the scent on foot into the ravine, moving through the dark with my heart slamming against my ribs. The trail led me to a patch of crushed vegetation, small and low, the kind that grows in the cracks of the rocks where rainwater collects. Something had walked through here, unsteady, dragging one side of its body low. My child's tracks. Small claw marks in the mud, spaced too far apart, as if it had been stumbling more than walking. Cressa landed beside me and crouched to study the ground. Alive when it passed through here, she said. Recently, maybe. The mud has not dried. Recently gave me hope. Recently also meant the storm had already passed, which meant my child had survived the wind and rain that had raged over this moon for the better part of a day. That alone was almost impossible for a hatchling so young. Something in me, some old and stubborn part of a mother's heart, refused to accept that impossible survival was not still possible. We followed the tracks deeper into the ravine, and the trail grew harder to read the further we went. In places the small prints vanished completely, swallowed by wider marks I did not recognize at first. Four-legged prints, heavy, moving in a pattern that spoke of a pack rather than a single animal. Ridge crawlers. I had hunted them before, back when I was young enough to still enjoy the hunt for its own sake. They were pack predators, low to the ground, built for chasing prey through narrow spaces, exactly like the one we were standing in. A grown warrior of my kind could fight off 2 or 3 of them without much trouble. A hatchling barely out of its egg case would not stand a chance against even one. My legs went weak beneath me for the first time since I had found the empty nest. I forced myself to keep moving, because stopping would mean accepting a truth I was not ready to accept. The trail led us to a wide, flat clearing between 2 rock walls, and there the ground told a story I did not want to read. Torn earth. Deep gouges from claws far larger than my hatchlings. A patch of scorched stone that had no natural explanation, black and glassy, the kind of mark left behind by a weapon, not by any predator native to this moon. I stood very still, forcing my mind to work through the evidence like a hunter rather than a mother, because a mother's fear would only slow me down. Something had fought the ridge crawlers here. Something had won. And whatever it was had not used claws or teeth to do it. Cressa knelt beside the scorched patch of ground and touched it carefully, testing the heat that still lingered faintly in the stone. This was recent too, she said. Within the last day, maybe less. I looked past her, further into the clearing, and my breath caught in my throat. There, half hidden beneath a fall of loose rock, were more tracks. Wider than a hatchling's, narrower than a ridge crawler's, pressed deep into the softened earth by weight that stood upright on 2 legs. Boots. Human boots. For a moment, the old fear rose in me again, sharp and immediate. The same fear that had sent me flying out of the spire without waiting for permission. If the humans had fought off the ridge crawlers, it meant they had been close enough to see, or hear, or smell whatever chase had ended in this clearing. It meant they had found my child, or the remains of my child, before I had. I forced myself to look closer, and what I saw made the fear twist into something even more confusing. The human tracks did not lead away toward their camp, in the triumphant, careless stride of hunters carrying home a trophy. They moved slowly, carefully, weaving around obstacles instead of trampling through them, and beside those careful boot prints, faint but unmistakable, was a second set of marks. Small drag lines, the kind left by something being carried close against a body, gently, with care taken not to jostle it. I did not know what to make of that. Every instinct I had ever trusted told me that humans did not show that kind of gentleness. not to a species they had every reason to fear and resent. And yet the evidence in front of me told a different story, one I was not ready to believe. "They took it," I said, and even as the words left my mouth, they sounded wrong, too simple for what the ground was actually telling me. Cressa did not answer right away. She was staring at the same tracks I was, her frills drawn tight against her skull, the way they did whenever she was thinking hard about something that did not fit the shape she expected. "Taken is one word for it," she said slowly, "but taken things are usually dragged or carried without care. This is not that. Look at how they walked. Look how careful the steps are, even around the loose stone. Whoever carried your child through here was not moving like someone running from a kill site with a prize. They were moving like someone afraid of dropping something they did not want to break." I wanted to argue with her. Every part of my long history with other species told me to expect the worst, to assume cruelty until proven otherwise, because assuming kindness from strangers had gotten better queens than me, killed in the old wars. But the tracks did not lie, and the tracks did not match the story my fear was trying to tell. I lifted my head and turned my sensory frills toward the wider trail leading out of the clearing, following the direction those careful boot prints had taken. It led north, toward the flat plain where the human camp had been raised only 3 days before. My hatchling's scent, faint but unmistakable, was woven into that same trail, moving in the same direction, at the same pace, as if it had traveled the whole distance held close against something warm. I did not know yet whether that warmth belonged to a friend or an enemy, but I knew I would not rest, would not eat, would not stop moving until I found out for myself. "We follow it," I told Cressa, and this time my voice had steadied, hardened into something closer to the queen my people needed me to be, all the way to their camp if we have to. "If they have taken my child to use against my hive, I will bring the sky down on top of them. But if there is any other truth hiding in these tracks, I want to see it with my own eyes before I decide what kind of queen I need to become today." Cressa rose to her feet beside me, wings folding tight against her back, ready to move. "And if the trail leads somewhere we cannot walk into without starting a war we cannot take back." I looked north, toward the distant lights of the human camp just visible over the ridgeline, small and steady against the darkening sky. Somewhere in that direction was the answer to every fear currently tearing through my chest. Somewhere in that direction, I hoped with everything left in me, was my child. "Then I will decide that when I am standing in front of it," I said, "not before." We left the clearing together, moving fast and low along the trail, chasing a scent that grew stronger with every wing beat, carrying me toward an answer I could not yet imagine, and toward a truth about the humans that would change everything I believed about them before this day was finished. The ridgeline above the human camp gave me my first real look at what we were flying toward, and I landed hard on the stone edge to study it before going any further. Below us, spread across a wide shelf of flat rock, sat a cluster of pale domed structures, lit from within by a soft yellow light that had nothing of the harshness I expected from a human outpost. I had pictured something colder, something built for war, bristling with weapons pointed outward at every angle, ready to defend against exactly the kind of visit I was about to make. Instead, I saw simple shelters, a few pieces of digging equipment resting silent for the night, and thin trails of smoke rising from a cooking fire near the center of the camp. It did not look like a fortress holding a captive. It looked like a place where people were trying to sleep. Cressa landed beside me, folding her wings tight, her eyes scanning the camp with the same cold assessment she brought to every hunt. "No guards on the perimeter," she said quietly. "No weapons raised. If they took your child as a hostage, this is a strange way to prepare for what comes next." I did not answer her right away. My frills were still catching the scent trail, and it led directly down into the heart of that camp, stronger now than it had been in the ravine, mixed with new smells I did not recognize. Something warm, something that reminded me faintly of the fungus my hatchling liked to eat when it was too young to hunt for itself. That detail struck me harder than anything else so far. Ridge crawlers did not carry food for their prey. Kidnappers looking to use a hostage as a bargaining piece did not usually bother feeding it something it actually liked. Whatever waited for me down in that camp, the shape of it was growing stranger with every step closer I took. "We go down together," I said, "but we go carefully. If this is a trap, I want to see it coming before it closes." Tsingas. We descended along the shadowed side of the ridge, keeping low, moving the way hunters move, when they do not yet know whether they are the hunter or the hunted. The camp grew louder as we approached, though the sounds were nothing like what I expected. No shouted orders, no alarm calls, just quiet voices, low laughter, the clatter of tools being packed away for the night. A young human male crouched near the cooking fire, feeding small pieces of dry wood into the flame, while another human, older, with dark skin and graying hair, sorted through a crate of tools beside him. Neither of them looked toward the ridge where Cressa and I crouched in the shadows. Neither of them looked afraid, or alert, or ready for trouble. I studied them for a long moment, searching for any sign of the cruelty I had expected to find. I did not find it. What I found instead was something closer to exhaustion. The older human moved with the stiff, careful motions of someone who had not slept properly in days. The younger one rubbed at his eyes every few seconds, fighting to stay awake, even as he tended the fire. They looked tired, Cressa murmured beside me. Tired in a way that matches a difficult few days. Not tired in a way that matches victory. I did not want to admit how much sense that observation made. I had spent my whole life being told that humans were opportunists, that they took what they could and justified it after the fact, that any kindness they showed was simply a mask for some deeper advantage they hoped to gain. Standing here, watching two exhausted strangers quietly go about the business of ending their day, none of that old story fit what I was actually seeing. I moved closer, staying low along the rocks, until I found a gap between two of the domed structures, where I could see deeper into the camp, without being seen myself. My hatchling's scent was strongest here, drifting from somewhere near the center of the small settlement, past the cooking fire, past a row of equipment crates, toward a tent set slightly apart from the others. Before I could move any closer, a voice rang out behind me, sharp with alarm. "Movement on the east ridge. Everyone stay calm and stay where you are." I froze, every muscle locked tight, ready to fight or flee, depending on what happened next. Cressa's claws flexed at her sides, and for a heartbeat, I thought the peaceful scene below us was about to shatter into exactly the kind of violence I had feared from the very beginning. Instead, what happened next was nothing like what either of us expected. The camp did not erupt into chaos. No weapons were raised in our direction. The humans below simply went still, turning slowly toward the ridge, hands lifted where we could see them clearly, palms open and empty. The young man who had been tending the fire rose to his feet without any sudden movement, his eyes wide but not with the kind of fear that leads to violence. It was a different kind of fear, the kind that comes from being caught in the middle of something too big to control. "Please," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the open ground between us. "We are not armed. We are not here to hurt you. If you are looking for the little one, she is safe. I promise you she is safe." He had used a word that meant nothing to me in that moment, only that he had spoken of my hatchling as something known, something cared for, something with an identity beyond simply being a captive or a threat. I stepped out from the shadow of the rocks, letting the dim light from the camp fall across me fully, letting them see exactly what I was, and exactly how much danger I represented, if this turned out to be a lie. Several of the humans flinched back at the sight of me, and I could not blame them. I am not small, and I am not gentle in appearance, built more for war than for comfort, but none of them ran. None of them reached for a weapon. The older human with the gray streaked hair stepped forward instead, moving slowly, hands still raised, positioning herself slightly ahead of the younger ones, as though shielding them without seeming to realize she was doing it. As she drew closer, I recognized her, the lead scientist from the treaty meeting 3 days before, the same tired gray eyes, the same translator device clipped carefully to her collar. "Broodmother Sashkara," she said, and my true name in her mouth, spoken correctly despite the difficulty of my language for a human throat, startled me more than I wanted to admit. "I did not expect you to find us so quickly. I am glad you did." "Where is my child?" I said, and the words came out sharper and harder than I intended, cracked at the edges with 3 days of fear I had been holding back since the moment I found that empty nest. "She is here. She is alive. She has been cared for since we found her, and I want to explain everything to you before you decide what happens next, because I understand exactly how this looks, and I understand exactly why you have every reason to distrust what I am about to tell you. I wanted to demand proof immediately, to push past her, and search every tent myself, until I found the truth with my own senses, instead of trusting her words. But something in the careful, steady way she spoke, something in the exhausted patience behind her gray eyes, made me hold still long enough to listen. 3 days ago, she said, a storm grounded most of our equipment and forced us to shelter inside the main structure. During the worst of it, one of our younger researchers heard a sound outside, something small and in distress. Against every safety protocol we have, he went out into that storm to check, because he could not bear the thought of something suffering alone in weather like that. She gestured toward the young man who had spoken first, the one who had called out that my hatchling was safe. He stood a little straighter under her words, though his exhaustion was plain across his face. He found your child half buried under a rock overhang, already showing signs of venom exposure. We later confirmed it was ridge crawler venom, a substance that is fatal to most native species within a day if left untreated. We did not know at the time whether it would be fatal to your kind as well. We had no data on your physiology, beyond what was shared during treaty negotiations, which was not much. I felt my hearts twist painfully at the image she was describing. My hatchling, alone in the storm, poisoned, dying, and found not by its own hive but by strangers, with every reason to simply walk away and let nature take its course. You could have left it, I said, and it was not quite an accusation, though it came out sounding like one. You could have reported the location to my hive, and let us handle what came next. Why did you not simply leave it where you found it? The scientist's expression did not change, but something in her posture softened, as though she had expected this exact question, and had been carrying the answer with her the whole walk up to meet me. Because it was dying, she said simply, and because whatever treaty exists between our peoples, whatever history of mistrust sits between your hive and my species, none of that changes what kind of choice you make when something helpless is suffering in front of you. We treated the venom with what medical supplies we had. We kept her warm. We stayed awake in shifts because we were afraid that if we left her alone even for an hour, we might lose her. And we did not know how to reach your hive without risking exactly the kind of conflict none of us want. I stood very still, letting her words settle over me, feeling the shape of everything I had believed about humans start to crack under the weight of what I was hearing. You could not reach us, I said slowly, because our communication channels are only opened for scheduled treaty contact. You had no way to send word without appearing to violate the terms yourselves. Exactly, she said. We were caught between two dangers. If we tried to approach your spire directly, uninvited, carrying your missing hatchling, we risked being seen as invaders, or worse, as the ones who had taken her in the first place. If we did nothing, and she died in our care anyway, we risked being blamed for a death we had tried desperately to prevent. So we did the only thing we could think of. We cared for her as best we knew how, and we hoped you would come looking before either fear became the reality we were afraid of. I looked past her, toward the tent set apart from the others, the one where my hatchling's scent was strongest, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight since the moment I found that empty nest began, slowly, cautiously, to loosen. I want to see her, I said, now. The scientist nodded and stepped aside, gesturing toward the tent with a careful open hand, the gesture of someone offering, rather than commanding, someone who understood that whatever trust existed between us in this moment was fragile enough to shatter with the wrong word or the wrong movement. Her name, or the name we have been calling her while we waited to learn her true one, is Little Ember, she said. The color of her scales in the firelight reminded one of my researchers of a burning coal. I hope that was not too forward of us. I did not answer that immediately. I was already moving toward the tent, my whole body pulled forward by a scent I had been chasing since the storm first broke over my spire 3 days before. My heart's pounding with a hope I had not allowed myself to feel until this exact moment, standing at the edge of a human camp that had somehow, impossibly, become the safest place on this entire moon for a lost and frightened child of my own blood. The inside of the tent was warmer than the night air outside, lit by a single soft lamp hanging from a support pole, and the first thing I noticed was the smell, not the sharp, sterile scent I had expected from a human medical space, but something closer to home. Dried fungus, the kind that grows in the deep caves near our spire, arranged in a shallow dish beside a nest of folded blankets stacked several layers deep. And there, curled in the center of that makeshift nest, was my child. Her scales caught the lamplight in soft flickers of orange and gray, rising and falling with the steady rhythm of deep, undisturbed sleep. A bandage wrapped around her lower flank, clumsy in its wrapping, but tight enough to hold, dark with the stain of healed venom wounds beneath it. She looked smaller than I remembered, curled tight the way hatchlings curl when they feel safe enough to fully relax, and for a long moment, I could not make my legs carry me any closer, because I was afraid that moving would somehow break the fragile miracle in front of me. A young woman knelt beside the nest, her hand resting lightly near my hatchling's side, not quite touching, close enough to notice if her breathing changed. She looked up as I entered, and I watched fear and exhaustion and something like relief move across her face all at once. "You must be her mother," she said quietly, careful not to raise her voice and disturb the sleeping hatchling between us. "My name is Mara. I have been watching her through the nights while the others rested. I am glad you came." I crossed the remaining distance in 3 steps and knelt beside the nest, my whole body trembling in a way I had not allowed myself to feel since the moment this nightmare began. I reached out and let my hand rest against the warm curve of my child's back, and the moment she felt my touch, her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening with recognition. The chirp she made was small and cracked, weak from days of injury, but it was the most beautiful sound I had heard in my entire long life. She pushed herself up out of the blankets and pressed against me, and I gathered her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against my chest, feeling the proof that everything I had feared over the last 3 days had not come true. For a long moment I could not speak at all. I simply held my child and let myself feel the full weight of relief crashing through me, indifferent for that one moment to the humans watching, indifferent to the treaty, indifferent to everything except the simple fact that she was alive and breathing and safe. Mara sat back quietly, giving us space, wiping at her own eyes with the back of one hand. "She has been through so much," she said softly. "The venom hit her hard the first night. We were not sure she would make it through until morning. I have not slept more than an hour or 2 at a time since we found her, because every time I closed my eyes, I was afraid I would wake up and she would be gone." I looked up at her, studying her face properly for the first time. She was young, younger than the scientist who had met me outside, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of exactly the sleepless vigil she was describing. There was no calculation in her expression, no hidden agenda I could detect beneath the surface. Only tiredness and relief, and a strange, fragile kind of pride at having kept something alive against difficult odds. "Why?" I asked, and the question came out smaller than I intended, stripped of the authority I usually carried into every conversation. "Why would you risk so much for a creature that is not your own kind, from a hive your people do not fully trust, in a place where helping her could have gotten you blamed for her death, or accused of taking her in the first place?" Mara considered the question for a long moment before answering, choosing her words carefully. "Because she was suffering, and I was there, and I could help," she said. "I did not think about treaties or politics when I found her under that rock. I only thought about the fact that something small and frightened was dying in front of me, and I had the ability to try to stop that from happening. Everything else came after." Before I could respond, the quiet of the tent shattered. Outside, the night erupted with the sharp, unmistakable sound of hive war horns. 3 short blasts followed by 1 long one, the signal for immediate mobilization. I froze, every instinct screaming at me at once, because I recognized that call. It was the signal Cressa was authorized to sound only if she believed my life was in immediate danger and needed the full weight of the Spire's warriors brought to bear without delay. I had left her outside on the ridge, and somewhere between then and now, something had gone terribly wrong. I surged to my feet, my hatchling clutched instinctively against my chest, and pushed out through the tent flap into chaos. The sky above the camp was filling with shapes, dozens of them. Warriors from my own spire descending fast and low, weapons drawn, clearly prepared for exactly the kind of battle I had spent the last hour convincing myself would not be necessary. Cressa stood at the center of the camp, wings spread wide, positioned between the descending warriors and the small cluster of terrified humans who had scattered back toward their shelters at the first sound of the horns. Her expression, when she turned to find me emerging from the tent, was a mixture of relief and barely controlled fury. "You were gone too long," she said, loud enough to carry over the noise of the descending warriors. "I sent word to the spire, when the search stretched past the hour we agreed on. I feared the humans had taken you as well. I did not know what else to do." I understood immediately what had happened, and the understanding filled me with a cold dread that had nothing to do with ridge crawlers or venom or storms. Cressa had been afraid for me, exactly as I had been afraid for my hatchling, and her fear had triggered a response that was about to turn this quiet, exhausted human camp into a battlefield unless I stopped it in the next few seconds. "Stand down," I called out, my voice carrying the full authority of a broodmother across the noise and confusion. "All of you, stand down immediately. There is no threat here. My child is alive and unharmed, and these humans are the reason she survived at all." The warriors above hesitated, wings beating hard against the night air as they circled, weapons still raised, clearly uncertain whether to trust an order that contradicted everything they had been told to expect on this mission. One of them, a young warrior I recognized as part of Cressa's personal guard, dropped lower, his weapon still trained toward the cluster of human shelters, where several frightened faces peered out from behind canvas flaps. "Broodmother, if they have taken you captive, this could be a trap," he called down. "We cannot simply lower our weapons on your word alone if there is any chance you are being forced to speak against your will." The suspicion in his voice was not unreasonable. I had trained my warriors to expect exactly this kind of deception from a species we had spent generations distrusting, and I could hardly blame him for following that training now, even as it threatened to unravel everything I had learned over the last hour. I lifted my hatchling higher, letting the warriors above see her clearly, see the healed bandage wrapped around her flank, see her wide awake and alert eyes watching the chaos unfold around her, without any sign of the fear a true captive situation would have produced in a creature so young. "Look at her," I called out. "Does she look like a prisoner to you? Does she look harmed, starved, mistreated in any way? She looks fed. She looks cared for. She looks exactly like a child who has spent 3 days being nursed back to health by people who had every reason to abandon her and chose not to." The circling warriors slowed, weapons wavering, and I could feel the balance of the moment shifting, though it had not yet tipped fully in either direction. Below me, near the edge of the camp, I saw Mara emerge from the tent behind me, her hands raised, her voice shaking but steady, as she called out toward the sky. "Please, we are not your enemy," she shouted, and though her translator device struggled slightly with the pitch and speed necessary to carry across the noise, the meaning came through clearly enough. "We found her hurt and dying, and we tried to save her because it was the right thing to do. We are not soldiers. We do not want to fight." I watched the young warrior above hesitate, his weapon dropping a fraction of an inch, his eyes moving between the frightened human standing exposed and unarmed below him, and the healthy, alert hatchling cradled safely in my arms. Something in that comparison seemed to reach him in a way my words alone had not quite managed. "Cressa," I said, turning to my second in command, keeping my voice level despite the tension still crackling through the air around us. "Order the warriors to land, weapons lowered, formation broken. This ends now, peacefully, or it becomes a mistake none of us can undo." Cressa studied me for a long moment, and I watched her weigh the evidence in front of her, the same way she had weighed the tracks in the ravine hours before, judging what she saw against what she had been trained to expect. Finally, she raised her arm and gave the signal, 3 sharp gestures that every warrior in the sky understood without needing further explanation. One by one, the warriors descended, wings folding, weapons lowering, until the war party that had arrived ready for battle stood instead in a loose, uncertain circle around the edge of the human camp, watching their queen hold a healthy hatchling in her arms, while a young human woman stood shaking, but unharmed only a short distance away. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise that had preceded it, filled with the weight of a disaster narrowly avoided, and the strange, unfamiliar shape of a truth none of my warriors had been prepared to encounter tonight. I looked around at the faces of my own kind, warriors who had flown into this camp expecting to rescue their queen from captivity, or worse. And I saw the same confusion I had felt myself only an hour earlier, the slow, difficult process of an old certainty cracking apart under the weight of new evidence. "Stand easy," I told them, my voice softer now, though it still carried across the quiet camp. "We came here believing the worst of these people. We were wrong. I need every one of you to understand exactly how wrong we were, because what happened here tonight almost cost us a peace that took generations to build, over a misunderstanding that never needed to happen at all." Cressa stepped closer, studying my hatchling with an expression I had rarely seen on her hardened face, something close to wonder. "She truly is unharmed," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "After everything in that ravine, after the venom, after the crawlers, she is alive and well, and it is because of them." "Yes," I said, "it is because of them." I turned back toward the tent, toward Mara still standing at its entrance, her hands finally lowering now that the immediate danger had passed, her exhaustion plain across every line of her face. Behind her, the older scientist emerged as well, moving carefully through the tense crowd of warriors still filling the camp, her eyes scanning the scene with the same careful assessment she had shown from the very beginning of this strange, difficult night. "I owe you an apology," I said, and the words felt strange in my mouth, unfamiliar in a way that had nothing to do with language and everything to do with pride. "My warriors came here ready for war because I stayed too long, and their fear for my safety nearly cost your people everything. That should never have happened, and I take full responsibility for the danger you were placed in tonight." The scientist shook her head slowly, though her voice carried no anger when she spoke. "Fear makes all of us do things we would not otherwise do, Broodmother. Your warriors were afraid for you, the same way we were afraid for her, the same way you were afraid for the same reason 3 days ago. I understand fear. I do not hold it against your people, as long as it ends the way it ended tonight, with everyone still breathing, and no one worse for the encounter." I looked down at my hatchling, still cradled safely against my chest, already drifting back toward sleep despite the chaos that had erupted around her only minutes before, entirely unaware of how close tonight had come to a very different ending. "There is still much I do not understand about your people," I said, looking between Mara and the older scientist, and then out across the wary, watching faces of my own warriors surrounding the camp. "But I understand this much clearly now. Whatever divides our two peoples, whatever history of mistrust sits between us, none of it changed what kind of choice these humans made when they found something helpless and dying in the storm. That is not nothing. That is not a small thing to have learned tonight." The camp remained quiet a moment longer, warriors and humans alike still processing how close the night had come to disaster, before Cressa finally spoke, her voice carrying the first hint of something almost like respect. "What happens now, Broodmother?" I looked down at my sleeping child, safe and warm in my arms after 3 of the longest days of my long life, and then back up at the tired, frightened, remarkably brave humans who had made that safety possible. "Now," I said, "we make sure something like this never happens again, not because the treaty demands it. Because they have earned better than fear from us, and I intend to see that they receive it." The warriors set up a watch perimeter at the edge of the camp, keeping their distance now, weapons stowed but ready, while Cressa organized a proper guard rotation instead of the chaotic swarm that had nearly ended in disaster. Inside the tent, the tension of the night slowly gave way to something quieter, and I found myself sitting cross-legged on the ground beside the nest of blankets, my hatchling curled against my side, finally willing to hear the full story of what had happened during the 3 days I had spent searching for her. Mara sat across from me, a cup of something warm cradled between her hands, and the older scientist, whose name I finally learned was Grace, settled nearby with a small data device balanced on her knee, though she made no move to use it, seeming to understand that this was not the moment for careful notes and observations. "Tell me everything," I said, "from the beginning. I need to understand what she went through, and what you did to save her." Grace nodded and began, her voice steady despite the exhaustion still evident in every line of her posture. "The storm hit us harder than our instruments predicted. We had most of our equipment secured, but visibility dropped to almost nothing within an hour of the first heavy winds. Owen, one of our younger researchers, was checking the perimeter seals on our main shelter when he heard something crying out in the dark. I glanced toward the young man who had been tending the fire earlier, now standing quietly near the tent entrance, listening to his own story being retold. He looked down at his hands, uncomfortable with the attention, though he did not look away. I almost did not go out there, he admitted, his voice quiet. Every safety protocol we have says to shelter in place during a storm of that intensity. But the sound she was making, I could not just leave her out there, whatever the protocols said. I told Grace where I was going, and went out with a light and a rope tied around my waist, so I would not lose my way back. He found her under a rock overhang, Grace continued, already shivering badly, a wound on her flank, that we later confirmed came from a ridge crawler bite, during whatever chase had brought her that far from your spire. She was barely conscious. Owen carried her back through the worst of the storm, and by the time they reached the shelter, she had stopped responding to sound or touch entirely. I felt my grip tighten instinctively around my sleeping child, the memory of that danger, even second-hand, sharp enough to make my heart ache. We did not know what the venom would do to her, Grace said. We had no data on your physiology beyond the basic treaty exchange, which covers almost nothing about medical needs. We made the decision to treat her the way we would treat any small creature suffering from a toxic bite, cleaning the wound, keeping her warm, monitoring her breathing and heart rate as closely as we could with the equipment we had on hand. The first night was the worst, Mara said quietly, picking up the story where Grace left off. Her breathing kept slowing, then speeding up again, and none of us knew whether that was normal for your species or a sign that we were about to lose her. I stayed awake the entire night, watching her chest rise and fall, terrified that if I looked away even for a moment, it would stop. By the second day, the fever had broken, Grace said. Her appetite came back, though we had to guess at what she might eat. Owen remembered seeing images of your hive's cave systems during the treaty briefing, and noticed some of the fungus growing naturally near our dig site that resembled what he recalled from those images. It was a guess, but it turned out to be the right one. I looked down at the small dish of dried fungus still sitting near the edge of the nest, understanding now the careful thought that had gone into even that small detail, a guess made not out of obligation, but out of genuine effort to give my child something familiar in an unfamiliar place. On the third day, Mara said, she started to seem more like herself. She was curious about everything, poking at our equipment, chirping at the lamplight, following us around the tent whenever she had the strength to move. That was when we started arguing about what to do next. Arguing? I repeated. Grace nodded. Some of the team believed we should attempt contact with your spire immediately, regardless of the treaty's communication restrictions, because the risk of appearing to have taken her captive seemed less dangerous than the risk of her dying in our care without your knowledge. Others believed that any unscheduled contact could be misread as an act of aggression, especially carrying an injured member of your hive, and that we should wait for the treaty's next scheduled exchange before attempting anything. We were still arguing about it tonight when you arrived, Mara admitted. I do not think any of us had a good answer. We were doing our best with an impossible situation, and hoping it would resolve itself before anyone had to make the wrong choice. I sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing the full shape of what they were describing. 3 days of careful, difficult decisions made by people who had every reason to walk away from the danger and the risk my hatchling represented to their own safety, and who had chosen instead to stay awake, to guess carefully, to argue in good faith about how best to help a creature that was not their own. You could have simply left the communication problem for us to solve, I said. You could have kept her hidden, treated her only enough to prevent immediate death, and waited for us to either find her ourselves or give up the search entirely. That would have been far less risk for your people. We thought about it, Grace admitted, and her honesty in saying so struck me more than any denial would have. But every option that involved less risk for us also involved worse outcomes for her. We could not bring ourselves to choose our own safety over her recovery, not when the difference meant whether she lived comfortably or simply survived in fear until someone came for her. Before I could respond, my hatchling stirred against my side, a small, uncomfortable sound escaping her throat, and I felt the warmth of her skin shift beneath my touch, climbing higher than it had been only moments before. Something is wrong, I said, alarm sharpening my voice instantly. Her temperature is rising. Grace was on her feet immediately, moving with the practiced speed of someone who had spent 3 days learning to react quickly to exactly this kind of change. She knelt beside the nest, pressing the back of her hand gently against my hatchling's side, her expression tightening with concern. "This happened once before, on the second night," she said. "A fever spike, likely a delayed reaction to the venom working its way fully out of her system. It passed on its own last time, but I want to monitor it closely regardless." My hatchling's breathing had grown quicker, shallow and uneven, and she whimpered softly, curling tighter against me, as though trying to escape a discomfort she did not have the words to explain. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to do something, anything, and the helplessness of not knowing what that something should be was almost unbearable after everything else this day had already put me through. "What do we do?" I said, and I did not try to hide the fear in my voice. Not anymore. Not after everything these humans had already seen of my fear tonight. "We keep her cool, keep her hydrated, and we watch closely," Grace said, already moving toward a small case of supplies tucked near the edge of the tent. "Mara, bring the cooling cloth. Owen, I need the readings from the monitor we used the first night, so we can compare against what we are seeing now." The tent filled with quiet, efficient motion, Mara returning quickly with a damp cloth that she pressed gently against my hatchling's flank, careful to avoid the healing bandage, while Grace checked readings against notes she had kept from the previous fever spike 2 nights before. I sat still through all of it, holding my child close, offering the only thing I truly had to give in that moment, the steady warmth and presence of a mother refusing to leave her side. "Talk to her," Grace suggested quietly, not looking up from her work. "Whatever calming sounds your kind uses for younglings, now would be the time. Familiar comfort matters as much as physical treatment in situations like this." I lowered my head close to my hatchling's ear and began the low, rhythmic call that every mother of my kind learns before her first clutch ever hatches, the sound meant to soothe fear and pain in equal measure, carrying with it the promise that safety was near, even when the body itself was struggling. Slowly, gradually, I felt her breathing begin to steady beneath my touch, her small body relaxing by degrees as the fever's grip loosened. "There," Grace said softly, checking the readings once more. "Temperature dropping. This looks like it is passing, the same way it did before." I did not fully relax until I felt my hatchling's breathing settle into the deep, even rhythm of true sleep once more, her small chirping sounds returning to their normal, contented pitch. Only then did I lift my head and look around at the tired, worried faces surrounding us. Humans who had spent the last several minutes working with quiet, practiced urgency to help a creature that was not their own, in a moment when every instinct might have told them to simply step back and let nature take its course. "This is what the last 3 days looked like for you," I said slowly, understanding now with a clarity I had not fully possessed before this moment. Not once. Not as a single act of kindness in a single dangerous night. Again and again, every time something threatened to take her from you, you chose to fight for her instead of stepping away. Mara wiped at her eyes again, the exhaustion of the last 3 days finally catching up to her, now that the immediate crisis had passed. She reminded me of my younger sister, back when she was very small and very sick, and there was nothing anyone could do but stay close and hope. I could not walk away from that feeling twice, even for a creature I had never met before 3 days ago. I looked down at my sleeping child, safe now, breathing steadily. The fever passed for what I hoped was the final time, and I felt something shift permanently in the deepest part of myself, some old, hardened belief about what humans were and were not capable of, finally giving way beneath the weight of everything I had witnessed tonight. "I came here believing I would find proof of everything I feared about your people," I said quietly, looking around at the small, exhausted group gathered in that tent. "Instead, I have found something I did not expect to find at all. I have found people willing to lose sleep, take risks, and fight through fear for a creature they had no obligation to save. That is not a small debt to carry, and I do not intend to forget it." Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern sky, painting the edges of the storm clouds still lingering from the night before, in soft shades of gray and gold. Inside the tent, my hatchling slept peacefully, finally safe, finally home in every way that mattered, even though the walls around her were made of human canvas instead of hive stone. I did not know yet exactly what I would do with everything I had learned in these last few hours, but I knew, with a certainty that settled deep into my hearts, that I would never again look at these strange, stubborn, remarkably brave humans the way I had looked at them only one day before. Dawn had fully broken by the time I carried my hatchling out of the human camp, her small body wrapped carefully in one of the blankets Mara insisted I take with me, still faintly warm from the tense lamplight. Cressa fell into step beside me, and behind us, the warriors who had descended in a fury only hours before now watched the humans with expressions far more thoughtful than the suspicion they had carried at the start of the night. I paused at the edge of the camp and turned back to face Grace, Mara, and Owen, who stood together near the cooking fire, watching us prepare to leave. The tiredness in their faces had not lifted, but something else had settled there alongside it, a quiet relief that came from having carried a heavy burden safely to its end. I will return, I told them, not simply to fulfill the terms of our treaty, but because I owe your people a debt I do not intend to leave unpaid. What happens next between our hive and your camp will not be decided by the old fears that brought me here in anger 3 days ago. Grace inclined her head in the careful, respectful gesture I remembered from our first meeting, though it carried a different weight now than it had then. We will be here, she said, and we will be glad to see her again, whenever your hive decides that visit is appropriate. The flight back to the spire felt different from the desperate, panicked journey that had carried me away from it the night before. My hatchling slept peacefully against my chest the entire way, untroubled by the wind or the distance, and for the first time in 3 days, I allowed myself to simply breathe, to feel the relief of her safety settle fully into my bones, without the sharp edge of fear cutting through it. The elders were waiting when we landed, gathered in the great hall at the heart of the spire, their expressions ranging from cautious relief to open curiosity as I entered carrying my recovered child. Word of the near disaster at the human camp had already reached them, carried faster than I could fly by the warriors who had witnessed it themselves, and I could see in their faces the same mixture of confusion and disbelief that had settled over my own thoughts throughout the long night. Eldest among them, an ancient queen named Thessaly, who had ruled through wars I had only read about in the old records, rose from her seat as I approached, her eyes moving from my face to the sleeping hatchling in my arms and back again. "Tell us what happened," she said. "All of it. The warriors who returned gave us fragments, but I want to hear the full account from the one who lived it." I stood before the assembled elders and told them everything, from the moment I discovered the empty nest, through the long, desperate search across the ravines, through the tracks that had told a story I refused at first to believe, through the tense standoff in the human camp that had nearly ended in bloodshed over a misunderstanding born from fear on both sides. I told them about the venom, the fever, the 3 sleepless nights spent by strangers who owed my hive nothing, and the quiet, stubborn kindness that had kept my child alive when simple self-interest would have suggested walking away. The hall was silent when I finished, every elder absorbing a story that contradicted decades of hard-learned suspicion about the humans and their intentions. "You are certain," Thessaly said finally, "that this was not some elaborate calculation on their part, some long-term strategy to win favor with our hive by staging a rescue they orchestrated themselves." I considered that possibility myself, I admitted. I searched for evidence of it the entire time I stood in that camp, because it would have been easier to believe than what I actually found. But there was no evidence of calculation, eldest, only exhaustion and fear, and the kind of stubborn care that cannot be faked convincingly across 3 sleepless nights and a genuine medical crisis. If it was a performance, it was one so costly and so risky that no rational strategist would have chosen it as a path to influence. Another elder, a warrior named Vorin who had lost kin in the old wars against species far less patient than the humans, leaned forward with a skeptical frown still creasing his weathered face. "Kindness toward one hatchling does not erase generations of conflict between our peoples and theirs, nor does it guarantee they will act the same way when the stakes are higher and the cost to themselves greater." "You are right," I said, meeting his gaze steadily. "One act of kindness does not erase history, and I am not asking this council to forget every hard lesson our hive has learned. But I am asking you to consider what kind of history we choose to build going forward, now that we have new evidence about what these particular humans are capable of when it matters most." They had every reason to protect only themselves. They chose instead to protect something helpless and unfamiliar, at real risk to their own safety and standing. That is not nothing, Elder Vorin. That is the foundation upon which real trust can be built, if we are wise enough to build it carefully, rather than dismiss it out of old habit. The council debated long into the morning, voices rising and falling around questions of treaty terms, security protocols, and the deep, difficult work of unlearning suspicion that had been carried across generations. I listened to all of it, holding my sleeping child close, adding my voice where it was needed, but mostly allowing the elders to work through their own doubts in their own time, understanding that trust rebuilt too quickly is often trust that shatters just as fast. By the time the sun stood high overhead, the council had reached a decision that surprised even me in its scope. Rather than simply maintaining the fragile treaty as it stood, they authorized a new arrangement, one that would allow limited, scheduled contact between my hive and the human camp beyond the strict terms of the original agreement, built specifically around shared knowledge, mutual medical understanding, and the kind of careful cooperation that had saved my hatchling's life 3 nights before. This is not full trust, Thessaly said, addressing the council as the decision was finalized. Full trust is earned slowly, through many seasons and many tests, not granted in a single morning because of one difficult night, however meaningful. But it is a beginning, and beginnings matter more than most of us are willing to admit when we are still afraid of where they might lead. I carried my hatchling back to the nursery that afternoon, settling her into a new nest built with extra care, extra warmth, extra vigilance after everything the last 3 days had taught me about how quickly safety could be lost and how much effort it sometimes took to win it back. She stirred as I laid her down, blinking up at me with the same wide, trusting eyes she had shown from the moment she first hatched, and chirped softly before settling back into sleep, utterly unaware of the diplomatic weight now resting on her small shoulders. I sat beside her for a long while, watching her breathe, thinking about everything that had changed in the span of 3 days. I had left the spire believing I understood exactly what humans were, exactly what they were capable of, exactly how much distance my hive needed to keep between our people and theirs to remain safe. I returned having learned that understanding built on old fear alone is not truly understanding at all, only a story we tell ourselves to avoid the harder work of actually looking closely at the people in front of us. In the weeks that followed, I returned to the human camp several times, first to formalize the new terms the elders had approved, and later, simply because Mara had asked, quietly, whether my hatchling might like to visit again, now that she was fully healed. I brought her myself, watching as she chirped excitedly at the sight of the tent she remembered, watching Mara's face light up with genuine delight at seeing the small creature she had nursed back to health, now strong and healthy, and curious about everything around her. Grace and I spent long hours during those visits, exchanging knowledge neither of our peoples had previously shared, medical information about our respective physiologies, careful discussions about the history and fears that had shaped both our species long before either of us had been born into the roles we now carried. It was slow work, and difficult in places, old suspicions surfacing unexpectedly, even as new understanding grew alongside them. But it was real work, built on something more solid than the fragile treaty language that had governed our peoples for generations before. My hatchling grew stronger with each passing season, and as she grew, she carried with her a kind of familiarity with the human camp that none of my other clutch had ever possessed, an easy comfort around Mara and Grace and Owen that spoke of the deep, formative bond forged during those 3 frightening days when strangers had chosen to become something closer to family instead. I think often of that night, kneeling in the empty nursery pod with torn silk in my claws, certain that the worst had already happened, certain that my search would end in grief rather than relief. I think of the ravines, the tracks that told a story I refused at first to believe, the tense standoff in the camp that nearly became a battle over nothing more than fear misunderstanding itself into violence. And I think of the moment I finally found my child, sleeping safely in a human tent, wrapped in blankets and warmth, and a kind of careful devotion I had never expected to find outside the walls of my own hive. I came to that moon, believing I knew exactly what humanity was. Cruel, reckless, untrustworthy, in ways too deep to overcome. 3 days taught me something my entire long history had never quite allowed me to consider, that the short-lived, unpredictable creatures I had feared for so long understood something about mercy that reached further than any treaty, further than any old grudge, further than the careful distance I had spent my whole reign trying to maintain between our two peoples. My hatchling sleeps easiest now to the sound of human voices drifting through the camp during our visits, familiar and warm in a way that no longer surprises me. And if I am honest with myself, sitting quietly beside her nest in the soft hours before dawn, listening to those same distant voices carried on the wind, I have come to realize that so, slowly, and against every expectation I once carried, do I.